obstante as imensas reservas hídricas, vivemos um período de incertezas e aflições. Os reservatórios estão no limite e a situação só não é mais grave pelo aporte de energia térmica, que é mais cara para o Estado e para os consumidores. Por que não pesquisar outras fontes, outras matrizes, na busca de um sistema energético diversificado, integrado, equilibrado, confiável e barato? Por que não incluir o gás no cardápio energético brasileiro, como outros países têm feito e estão fazendo? Para debater a questão, o Instituto de Direito Aplicado, agora com o apoio da UNB e da Fundação Getúlio Vargas, convidou duas autoridades: o professor Ashley Brown, da Universidade de Harvard, reconhecido internacionalmente como um dos grandes e conceituados formuladores de modelos energéticos, e a doutora Simone Araújo, diretora do Departamento de Gás Natural do Ministério de Minas e Energia, e que conhece, como ninguém, a realidade brasileira do gás. Para presidir o seminário, nós convidamos o Dr. Gustavo Kercher, um dos expoentes do direito regulatório do Brasil, nosso consultor desde a primeira hora e nosso cúmplice em diversos momentos. Para apresentar os conferencistas, eu queria dar a palavra à doutora Joísa Dutra, e, em seguida, a presidência dos trabalhos para o Gustavo Kercher.
Boa noite. Antes de mais nada, eu gostaria de agradecer ao Dr. Betchal pelo início dessa parceria. Esse é um apoio extremamente bem visto por nós, bastante desejado, um momento fundamental para o país, como esse que vivemos. Várias são as notícias, né, que nos levam a fazer reflexões fundamentadas sobre o setor de energia, e o gás natural é um elemento fundamental nessa equação. Então, muito louvamos a iniciativa do IDA, e, então, nesse momento, contamos com duas pessoas que podem muito nos ajudar a discutir de modo aberto, né, e fundamentado, de modo profundo, equações possíveis para o momento que vivemos. As pessoas que farão uso da palavra, como já destacado pelo Dr. Betchal, são o Dr. Ashley Brown, que é diretor executivo do Grupo de Política do Harvard Electricity Policy Group, e um programa do Centro Mossavar-Rahman da Kennedy School, da Harvard Kennedy School, na Universidade de Harvard. Esse grupo conta há mais de 20 anos com um fórum para discussão e análise de questões relativas à energia elétrica nos Estados Unidos e no mundo. A doutora Ashley Brown já atuou como consultora em questões de regulação e regulamentação de infra-estrutura para iniciativa privada e também para governos de Brasil, Tanzânia, Índia, Ucrânia, Rússia, Filipinas, Zâmbia, Namíbia, Argentina, Costa Rica e Hungria, dentre outros. Lecionou em escolas públicas e universidades, frequentemente dá palestras em universidades e conferências no mundo todo, publica artigos sobre tema de interesse, e alguns deles com bastante popularidade, inclusive recentemente, sobre energias renováveis, relativos a aspectos de energia e regulação, tanto nos Estados Unidos como em outros países, e ele colabora já há algum tempo com o Centro de Estudos em Regulação e Infra-estrutura. A doutora Simone, então, diretora do Departamento de Gás Natural do Ministério de Minas e Energia, especialista em políticas públicas e gestão governamental, graduada em Engenharia Química, mestre e doutora pela Universidade de Brasília. Atualmente, além das atividades inerentes ao departamento, coordena as ações necessárias à regulamentação da Lei do Gás, bem como a elaboração do Plano de Expansão da Malha de Transporte de Gás Natural. E atua também no acompanhamento e monitoramento dos projetos de petróleo e gás natural no âmbito do Programa de Aceleração do Crescimento. Então, doutor, agora, Gustavo Kercher, para início à moderação das discussões.
Boa noite a todos. A minha intervenção hoje se limita, então, agora a passar a palavra ao Dr. Ashley Brown para que faça a primeira apresentação da noite. Perguntas, eu acho que nós vamos deixar para o final das duas apresentações, também limitadas e coordenadas, aí sim, por mim, numa feição talvez um pouquinho mais ativa do que eu estou tomando agora. Então eu peço, por favor, Dr. Ashley Brown, faça...
Pode mandar isso. Eu quero agradecer a todo mundo por a oportunidade de participar neste evento. Eu tenho vontade de falar só português, mas Juíza explica para mim. Eu acredito que nossa língua é uma coisa muito bonita, mas depois sua palestra em português, acho que não posso continuar a acreditar. Então, infelizmente, eu vou falar inglês. This question of the natural gas market in Brazil is a profound question at this moment in particular, because for reasons that I will explain, I think the natural gas market in Brazil is a major impediment to the economy and a major impediment to dealing with the issues in the electricity industry. So I want to first talk about the issues as they relate to how to use a computer. Go back, if it goes back. Talk about some of the key characteristics of evolved markets in natural gas and what's going on in Brazil. And I want to start with first acknowledging that there are things that explain why Brazil is different, perfectly legitimate things that make it different than, say, common law countries like the US or Great Britain, but also that make it different because of the resource base. But there are also certain institutional characteristics of the market in Brazil that I think are a major handicap to Brazil. In the first place, the question of historically the prices of natural gas and the prices of oil were linked. So if oil went up, gas went up, and the contrary would be true. In much of the world now, and especially in North America, that's no longer true. Those two markets are completely diverged from one another. Oil prices are high, gas prices, even though they're beginning to increase a little in North America, they still remain low relative to oil prices. So the linkage between the two is disappearing, and it's less important in Europe than it used to be. Vertical integration in Brazil, of course, is a characteristic. I mean, obviously, Petrobras is the dominant player in transmission and in exploration and production. It's not the only player in distribution, but it's the predominant player because, with the exception of Rio and São Paulo, it owns either entirely or at least in large part all of the gas distribution companies in Brazil. Now, Rio and São Paulo are major exceptions, but they are the only real exceptions to that. So there is vertical integration, whereas in more developed and more competitive markets, vertical integration is a thing of the past. In North America, for example, in the 1980s, gas pipeline companies were prohibited from selling natural gas. They could not participate, they cannot participate in the natural gas commodity market. And originally, most of them opposed that. They thought that was a terrible idea and thought it would cost them a lot of money. But in fact, now they're mostly happy with it. Why? Because there are many more people selling gas, and the more gas they sell, the more they use the pipelines, and the more money the pipelines make. And so they actually end up with more revenue rather than less revenue because they are not only de-verticalized, but they're also open access. Now, in Brazil, open access, of course, historically has not been the case. In the new law, there's clearly envisioned a progress toward open access, but it's not quite there. You also have competing pipelines in the U.S. Now, there's a lot of historical reasons why that probably didn't develop in Brazil and may be more difficult to develop. But the point is, when you think of the market in North America, and this is also true in many parts of Europe, although not all of Europe, you can move gas from one pipe across different pipelines. And you have those alternatives. So there's that form of competition. But more importantly, and frankly, it's not so important as to whether you have multiple pipelines. What's more important is that the pipeline itself be open in more than one way. One is open access, so all producers have access to sell to all buyers. There may be distribution companies involved in that too, but the point is that you have open access. But the second is, even with one system, that doesn't mean that only one company needs to own all the capacity. You can have a secondary capacity market, which simply means that even though I may own the pipeline, Anderson Fleming may own 30% of the rights to use the pipeline, and Joisa may own 20%, and Joisa can sell her 20% or 10% to Gustavo. So you have a secondary market. So even though you have the owner and operator of the pipeline, in fact, that pipeline doesn't need to be a monopoly because you can have a secondary market. And what's particularly useful about that is if a company doesn't want to invest in new pipelines, it can sell secondary capacity to raise capital and share the risk of building the new pipeline. It doesn't have to fall on a single investor. And there is no particular policy, there's no strong policy reason or practical reason why you could not have a secondary market in Brazil. There may be reasons why you don't have competing pipelines, but that doesn't explain why you wouldn't have capacity markets that you can trade in. You also would have a real-time market that, in fact, in developed markets, you can buy on long-term contracts or short-term contracts, or you could not buy in advance at all and buy on the spot market because there are hubs, the Henry Hub and others, where you can simply reference a price and you buy at the spot market price. And so if you decide, if you're a thermal generator or you're an industrial consumer whose need for gas fluctuates, you can sign contracts for some minimal supply that you think you need and leave yourself open to the real-time market, which may lead to higher prices or lower prices, but you can manage your own risk as a user of gas. In the absence of a real-time market, what you're forced to do is essentially buy long-term for everything, even paying for gas that you don't normally may not always need and frequently don't. This has huge, See, I may know about gas markets, but I don't know about computers. Should I continue or?
Just a minute.
Okay. It's there, but it's not here. Well, the one slide is up, so I'll finish with this slide. The other thing that in a competitive market one would have is a function called market monitor. So if you want to know if there's capacity available in a pipeline, you don't rely on a pipeline, and particularly a pipeline which is also in the commodity business, to tell you that in fact you have. This is forward, and okay, thank you. And so you have a kind of a regulatory function that actually requires two things. One is it requires transparency in what's being used and what's not being used, transparency on a real-time basis. And it's somebody who's neutral, who actually has access to that information. And if somebody tells you that they don't have capacity, somebody can actually say, yes, that's true, or it's not true. They do have capacity. And actually, if you make the pipeline independent of the commodity business, if you think about it, all economic incentives to deny capacity are gone. The only incentive is to use more and more of the capacity until you physically can't do it anymore. If you have a pipeline in the commodity business, they have an incentive to tell their competitors they don't have capacity while they have capacity for their own supply. And so you need to have two things. One is a monitor and also the right economic incentives in place to do that. The other thing one of the things that's missing in Brazil at the moment is the absence of storage facilities. What's the value of storage? Well, gas prices fluctuate. So somebody could buy gas at a time when prices are low and pay to store it and take it out of storage when prices go down. Or when supply is plentiful, they can buy and store it for when supply is low. And so what you have is an equilibrium in the market. And yet, in Brazil, there's not a single underground storage facility in the whole country, although there are some being discussed and planned, but there is not one in existence at the moment. That's a major hindrance because it removes a lot of flexibility from the marketplace. Also, you could obviously, in a case where you're importing gas, like liquefied natural gas, you would have a diversity of owners. Different terminals are owned by different companies, so nobody has a monopoly on transmission, or excuse me, on unloading the LNG. Whereas in Brazil, you don't have that diversity of ownership. It's in a single company. In production, the commodity business, you would have many producers in a competitive market, and in Brazil, of course, you don't have many. You have more than one, but one is predominant and dominant in the marketplace. There are a lot of reasons for that I'll talk about. But as I say, in more competitive markets, people who own network facilities like pipelines or LNG terminals are not allowed in the competitive commodity business, and people in the commodity business similarly are not allowed to participate in the transportation business. They're in two different businesses, and the idea is not just to make things more transparent, although it does that, not simply to say make the market more competitive, although it does that, but also to line up the incentives. So the only incentive of a pipeline or an LNG terminal is to maximize the amount of gas that moves through it. And it doesn't matter where it comes from. It doesn't matter who it comes from. All that matters is they're going to transport it, and the more they get to transport, the happier they are. And if they have more than they can provide, that's even better because it gives them an incentive to build more. So the idea is right now, if you have a vertically integrated gas company, the incentives are wrong. Where do they make their money? Selling the commodity and denying access to competitors? Yes, they make money that way. Is that a right incentive? Well, you can argue about how dominant players behave, but the fact is it's unusual. The incentives are not correct. As I say, the purchase options in a competitive market are you have spot markets, you have long-term, short-term, medium-term contracts, and you can buy interruptible service. For example, thermal generators don't need the gas all the time because they're not generating all the time. They're only going to be dispatched at certain times. So why shouldn't they be able to resell their gas? It would do two things. One is it would make the electric sector more efficient. Three things. It would allow more flexibility for industrial users who could buy and resell their gas. And it would make the power sector more efficient because then gas becomes not a fixed cost through take-or-pay contract, but a variable cost reflecting the actual use of the fuel. I mean, if you think about it, Brazil is one of the few places in the world, there aren't many, where gas is a fixed cost of generating electricity. There are very, very few countries, in fact, I'm not sure if there are any others, but there may be, where that's the case. What does that do to the price of electricity? It drives it up. And why? And even if they're on take or pay, why deny that generator the ability to sell the gas when they don't need it? So they take on the obligation to pay, but they take on the risk of selling it if they don't need it. What's the argument against that? But in Brazil, it's difficult to do. And it's very difficult to find an economic reason for that. There are a lot of political reasons one might explain it with, but not a lot of economic reasons. The other thing you can do in a more competitive market is you can have hedges, you can have swaps, you've got a reference price that you can hedge against. If you don't want to take a lot of risk, you can sell that risk to somebody else, or you could swap, and you can do a lot of things that in the absence of a competitive market, in the absence of a reference price, you can't do. So those markets, that level of flexibility of hedging and swapping and derivative products is just not available here. It's not available because it can't be available. It's not available because the institutions are set up in a way that prevent them from that market evolving. And of course, as I mentioned, you have hubs that facilitate trading and give a reference price as to what the prices would be that allow all these derivative markets to actually function. Now, some other things that I think are critically important. One, which I think gets doesn't get enough attention is licensing. And by licensing, I mean concessions. There's a recent study that a colleague of mine at Harvard did on the emergence of shale gas in the United States. And one of the things he said is it's going to be difficult for shale gas to develop in other countries because the institutional barriers to entry are there. Where did the shale gas revolution come from? Did it come from the American equivalent of Petrobras, Shell? These are all private, but they're big, giant companies. Did it come from Shell? Did it come from BP, which is not exactly American? Did it come from Exxon? No. Did they have any interest in expanding the world of gas? No. Where did it come from? It came from small, niche players, entrepreneurs who saw an opportunity. And then once they started making money, a miracle. Shell was interested, BP was interested, Exxon, but they will never innovate because they have no incentive to innovate. Their incentives are to maintain the status quo. So when you're reliant on a single giant company, and frankly, I don't think it makes any difference if it's state-owned or private. They behave similarly. When you have market-dominant players, they do not innovate in general. They don't have no incentive to do that, other than the things that will improve their bottom line. But if you dominate the market, why would you want to bring a new product to market? You wouldn't. And in Brazil, this is made even worse because this is one of the few countries in the world that links the monopoly power in oil to the monopoly power in gas. Most of the world, gas and oil compete with each other. And in the oil market, you can understand the role of a national champion. It's a global market. I mean, I don't necessarily agree with it, but I understand there's logic. What is the logic for a national champion in a market that's not global? Gas is, for the most part, not a global market. They're on the margins with liquefied natural gas, it's global. But that's the margins. Gas markets are regional, even local in some cases, but they're basically regional markets. What is the logic for a national champion in the gas market? And what is the logic for having an oil company have a gas monopoly? Wouldn't you optimally, from the standpoint of the economy, want those two fuels to compete with each other, as opposed to be controlled by the same entity? So this is a real institutional barrier. And what you'd really like to have is the maximum amount of competition, gas competing with gas and gas competing with oil. In Brazil, it's very difficult to do either under the current institutional arrangements. And so it becomes I think it's a major handicap for the Brazilian economy. So in regard to the natural gas market, and then I'll talk a little about how it relates to electricity, these are my very unbiased, objective views. There's too much market power, both vertical and horizontal. There's a lack of access and a lack of secondary markets. There's the absence of derivatives and financial products, physical absence of storage. The barriers to entry are significant. And let me emphasize something here about the barriers to entry. In Brazil, you have a very bureaucratic concession process. There's also the authorization process. And people often say, well, we have to have that in Brazil because unlike North America or the United Kingdom, we have all the resources belong to the state and they're not private. And that's true, that's a difference. But you have to ask yourself, what is the state's interest in using the resources? And the state has really three interests. One is the overall efficiency of the economy. The second is royalties that are paid to the state because you're using public resources. And the third, of course, is environmental safety and other regulation that needs to enforce, to look at the public interest. So if that's the case, then why do we have a concession process that goes out and looks at where the government says, here's this geographic area, here's that geographic area, here's this, and we'll open these up to bids, to auctions. So the auctions are good because they're transparent. But another way of doing this is to say the opposite. We want people to have an incentive to go out and produce. We want private businesses and state-owned companies, for that matter, to go out and have an incentive to look for the resource. Look for gas, look for whether it's conventional or unconventional gas, and not rely on the state to look for them. And how do you do that? You would say, well, except for certain environmentally sensitive areas, we will grant multiple concessions all across the country. Semigi, you can bid for one. Copel, you can bid. Comgas, you can bid. But you go out and you bid anywhere except in certain areas, but you give it to enough players in the market that what you end up with is not a market-dominant player, but many players. And everybody can do their own geological research. And you simply say, this is what you're going to have to pay the state for access to, for using those resources, because the resources belong to the state. And these are the rules you have to follow to protect the environment and public safety. And you end up with but instead we have a rather bureaucratic process where we identify regions, the entrance barriers become very high, and for small niche players, like the players who developed the shale gas revolution, they're frozen out of the market. And the argument that, well, the resources under the ground belong to the state and don't belong to private parties, while that's true, that's really not a barrier, and it's not a reason to do things that way. I mean, whoever gets the royalties gets the royalties. That's all that's a question of. But the state doesn't have to administer the concessions in ways that keep people out. In fact, if you want to develop the market, the obvious thing is to lower the entry barriers and let people in, not keep them out. And the result, of course, of all this, and then there's the link between oil and gas, which I think is a problem. And all this gets reflected in high prices, inflexibility of products, and a market that's highly inefficient. And let me go into briefly why this has an impact, first, why the gas market has an impact on the electricity market, and then second, why the electricity market has an adverse impact actually on the natural gas market. First up, the supply of gas, as I say, in a thermal generation ought to be in every place in the world except Brazil, it's basically a variable cost. In Brazil, it's more of a fixed cost because you don't have flexibility in how you buy the commodity. And that's just a fundamental error that costs the power sector money. It discourages thermoelectric generators from getting into the business, and you have a concentration of ownership in the thermal sector, which I don't think is in anybody's interest, except maybe the owner. And beyond that, you have it costs the economy a lot of money, a lot of inefficiency. Secondly, you would get multiple thermal generators, which is good. More competition, more requirements to be, or more competitive pressure to be more efficient, to be more increased productivity. All those are good things. You could also do things that are very common in other electricity markets you can't do here. For example, tolling agreements. What's a tolling agreement? I'm a generator. I build a plant, and then I sell Semigi the right to 50% of my output. And Semigi says, but all I want you to be is available when I want you, and don't worry about the gas, I'll buy the gas. So all I'm paying you for is capacity. If I'm a thermal generator, this is wonderful. It takes a risk off my back. It gets me some incentive to get into the market because all I have to do is perform. I don't have to worry about the fuel market. And many suppliers are perfectly willing to do that because they'd rather control the price of gas than leave it to somebody else to control the price of gas, to the extent to which you can control it as a buyer. So, and when I say Semigi, I mean any distribution company in all of Brazil. Semigi is more than a distribution company, but any large customer in Brazil. Okay, why wouldn't you want the flexibility of offering those kinds of products in the market? You can't do that in Brazil because because the concerns about the availability of gas and because of the requirements now in the auction process that you've got to have so much of your gas locked up in a contract. And the result of that is higher prices, lack of flexibility, and there's no logical reason, no reason rooted in economics, they're just reasons rooted in institutional arrangements in the Brazilian market. Another thing you can do is heat rate contracts. In other words, if I'm a producer and I have a contract with Semigi, and my contract guarantees them a certain heat rate, they may have to supply the fuel, but I have to guarantee a level of performance. So that's another way to get more productivity into the sector. Those kinds of contracts are very common in the U.S. and Europe, but they're not. But you can't do that in Brazil because of the fuel supply issues. And obviously, to the extent to which you bring more gas to the market, you have reserve margins. Why is there concern about shortage of supply in electricity in Brazil? Because the market is still heavily hydro. It will be for a long time, but two things are happening. One is when you have drought, like you've been having, if you don't have a diverse resource base, you do run bigger risks of shortages, of apagón. Whereas if you had a gas market, a thermal generation, you could have a lot more flexibility to avoid those kinds of things. And the other problem in the longer term, forget whether there's a drought or not, although we know every few years there's going to be a drought in Brazil. We know that historically to be true. What's more important is you cannot build reservoirs anymore in Brazil. It's politically impossible. It's physically possible, but politically try to do it. And if you're going to have run-of-the-river plants, that means the reserve margins you've been able to have because of reservoirs, the storage capacity for energy, is going to be reduced in proportion to demand. And so you must find an alternative. And all that, frankly, gets even more important when one thinks that in 9 years, you have to renegotiate Itaipu. And that's not going to be easy. Paraguay has other ideas about how things might be done. And so that way, if you take Itaipu's predictability out of the equation of supply in Brazil, that just magnifies the problem and makes the case for creating a more flexible gas market even more important. The other thing, as I was going to say, there are a few things that I want to point out in the electric market. Those are things that the gas market inhibits the electric market. But there are also some things that go in the other direction. For example, in Brazil, transmission pricing. One of the ways that you could benefit or provide an incentive for thermal generation, is by having locational prices for transmission. It's a fiction. In Brazil, the price that the customer pays for output from when Madeira is done, from Belo Monte, the price the customer pays in São Paulo and the price somebody pays in Maranhão for transmission are the same. Does anybody believe the costs are the same? And it's not just the cost of distance, it's the cost of congestion. Who pays for the cost? Now it's all socialized. If you price that congestion, what that does is it does several things. One is it reflects the real cost, but from the standpoint of thermal generation, it's an incentive to build plants in locations that actually enhance transmission capability. And thermal generation clearly is far more flexible in locating than hydro resources. Hydro resources have very little flexibility. And so when you don't have locational prices, that tends to be a subsidy to hydro and a subsidy that works against thermal. So if you have locational prices, you neutralize it. It's not to benefit thermal, but simply to reflect the actual costs and the effects of those costs on the system. Another thing that's a problem is in Brazil, the regulation of natural gas is tied to the regulation of oil. Well, if you think about it logically, there's more synergies between there should be, at least in an economic, even a close to optimal economic model, there's more symmetries between gas and electricity than there are between gas and oil. And perhaps what one ought to think about is combining the regulation of gas and electricity and leave oil as the separate entity rather than combining oil and gas. Then you wouldn't have situations like you had just a few years ago in the Northeast where you built these gas generators and nobody built the gas pipelines. And you couldn't rely on it. You actually have a single regulator that's overlooking both of those. So these are some of the issues. So the conclusion here is that the gas market is actually a major inhibition, or the dysfunctional gas market is a major inhibition on the growth of on electricity markets, and it's a major burden for the Brazilian economy to bear, and it's hard to think of much benefit that offsets those costs. Muito obrigado.
Bom, sem mais delongas, passo então a palavra para a doutora Simone.